I'd like to bring in Joseph Bahout. He's a visiting scholar in the Middle East program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace here in Washington. His research focuses on politics in Lebanon and in Syria. Welcome. Thanks for coming to the show.
Thanks for having me.
You know, we see what is happening right now with the hospital bombings, the shellings by Turkey, and all these accusations going back and forth. Just last week, we had this big meeting with world powers talking about this ceasefire, which is actually supposed to start in a few days. So where do things stand right now?
Look, as you said, in fact, the Munich agreement about the ceasefire, or more precisely the cessation of hostilities, is supposed to enter into effect Friday, in a few days from now. However, since the minute it was incepted, it was already largely torpedoed and fragilized. It was fragilized because on the one side, the Russian and the Syrian regime said that they would consider that some of the factions that are battling on the ground are excluded from this ceasefire, and they have a very broad definition of what they consider terrorist organizations. And on the other side, it was also fragilized by Turkish, let's say, intervention on the ground by shelling the Kurdish factions, and also the Saudi announcement that you mentioned already about a possible ground intervention against ISIS in Syria. So to that day, tonight, we can say that, I mean, it would really be a miracle if the ceasefire enters in effect Friday, but I would also go further than that and say that maybe we are also on the verge of a regional confrontation today in Syria.
So would you say we're at a tipping point right now?
I think it's one of the many tipping points of the Syrian crisis. Unfortunately, this crisis has been dragging on for 5 years. We have seen several tipping points. This one is a very serious one because probably it could plunge the Syrian issue into a kind of regional and maybe international conundrum. We could begin to see an open confrontation between Turkey, maybe Saudi Arabia on the one hand, and Russia, Iran, and the Syrian regime on the other hand, and this probably would put the US government in a very, very dire situation because it will have to choose between allies, Saudi Arabia and Turkey, and between partners in the Syrian affairs like Russia so far. So I think that this situation is now raising a huge challenge for a lot of parties in the region and internationally.
And speaking of that, Saudi Arabia, as we speak, hosting a massive military exercise with 20 countries in the region. What do you make of this exercise? It's called North Thunder, and what do you think will come out of it?
I think there's a direct relation to the Syrian crisis. Of course, it is officially not completely related. You know that Saudi Arabia, for a year from now, has decided to be bolder in its foreign policy and its military policy. It's taking things at hand. It has intervened in Yemen. Now it's talking about intervening maybe in Syria, although we don't know the limits and the nature and the scope of this intervention. So these maneuvers that are going to start today or tomorrow probably are a very important factor to take into consideration. Of course, this is putting aside a huge coalition of Sunni countries, Gulfis and non-Gulfis, and this is probably the ground force that Saudi Arabia is talking about to battle ISIS in Iraq and Syria. The US administration have welcomed this coalition in order to fight ISIS. However, I think that if it's in fact concretized and put in effect, the US government will have to square this off with other constraints, like, for example, the Russian presence in Syria.
We have about 30 seconds left. We mentioned Turkey in its comments that it would take part in some sort of ground incursion with help, but do you think we're actually closer to seeing something happen with or without help?
I think that the Turks have a clear red line. They can't accept that what we call the Azaz corridor that links Aleppo to the Turkish border be closed completely off and hermetically closed off. However, their options are very limited. A ground intervention would be very risky. They already said that it would be unenvisageable without a US support. However, shelling, air flights and etc. are maybe in the cards, but this will also once again put Turkey closer in a potential confrontation with forces on the ground, mainly the Kurds, Russia, and the Syrian regime.
All right. Joseph Bahout, thank you so much. We appreciate
Thank you. My pleasure.
Your time.